So, hi, Jon. Welcome. It's lovely
Hello,
to
Ruth.
see you.
Hello.
So I'll introduce myself and then maybe ask you to do the same. My name is Ruth Beecher, and I'm a historian and a postdoctoral researcher on the Sexual Harms and Medical Encounters research team at Birkbeck. We're funded by the Wellcome Trust, and we're part of the University of London. And I'm really so glad to meet you, Jon, and to introduce someone who has done so much for adult survivors of sexual abuse over the last 20 or more years. So welcome, and would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Ruth. Great to be with you at Birkbeck. My name's Jon Bird. I've been involved in NAPAC, National Association for People Abused in Childhood, for about 20 years. First 10 years of that was as a volunteer on the Board of Trustees. So I was the chair of trustees for the last 5 of those years up until 2011. When I took a paid post in middle management, basically an operations manager, line managing service delivery as the charity started to expand. That whole operation has now moved away from London up to Stockport, Greater Manchester. So I've now got a different job title, which is Head of Research and Analysis, which basically means writing it all up.
And would you like to say a little bit And would you like to say a little bit about NAPAC and how it came to be established and what it does?
Yeah. It's about 23 years now, I think, since the charity was first set up. And as the name suggests, it's for any adult, so all genders, and it's for any survivors of any type of childhood abuse or neglect. So not only sexual. I got involved from the very start for that main reason. I'm a survivor, and I knew that it's sexual abuse doesn't generally occur in isolation. It's usually accompanied by other types of cruelty and trauma, and circumstance and context is really important. And it's hard to split it all apart. So that's why I got involved. We're a very small charity, although we have had quite a bit of exposure since the Jimmy Savile revelations in 2012. And that was mainly because at that time, our support line number was the only sort of national support line available for this kind of thing. And the producers of the documentary about Jimmy Savile ITV exposure, which went out in October 2012, came to us and said, "Do you mind if we put your support line number up at the end of the programme?" And we went, "Sure, fine, that's what we do." And the floodgates opened. And really, it's not slowed down much since. So we have had a huge amount of exposure following from that, really, and all the other things like the inquiry and various changes in policing, government, mental health. So, yeah, it's a lot has been happening.
So that Jimmy Savile sort of scandal and publicity and the documentary and everything that came out of it was a bit of a sea change moment then in terms of support for victim survivors.
Well, it was, I suppose what really changed was that people started to believe it. I think before that, it had been easy to dismiss it. And people, you know, in really quite senior positions in government, in police, in health, would say, "You're overstating it. And there is no epidemic or pandemic or whatever you want to call it." And then it became apparent that there are such people who were so prolifically violent against children. Serial rapists is what we're talking about. That was news to a lot of people, including the police. So I think it's the belief that changed. We're still waiting for the services to arrive. Unfortunately, there's very little service provision in the mental health sector, either in the public sector, in the NHS, although there's some excellent work being done by some teams. So much of the support is still delivered through the charity sector. And it is organisations who've been doing it for years, like Rape Crisis, been doing it far longer than us, and they work with non-recent abuse as well as people who suffered sexual violence recently. And many small charities around the country who are still struggling for funds and who all have a huge queue. So service provision for survivors, particularly adult survivors, is patchy still, unfortunately, but the police believe it and the government believes it now. That's the change, I think.
Right. And I suppose one of the things we talked about before, and I think a lot about in my research, is how adults listen to children and young people and young adult survivors as well, and how that might have changed over the period I'm looking at, which is really since the 1960s, 1970s. And when we spoke before, I was really struck that you said two things, I think, that kind of echoed each other. One was you said what happened when you tried to tell people that you had been sexually assaulted when you were a very small boy in the 1960s, and you told your mother and she told you, forget about it. And then in the 1990s, which, so 30 years later, you went to the GP as an adult and he told you virtually the same thing. It happened a long time ago. Forget about it. Get on with your life. And I wondered if you could reflect on that and whether, how you think things have changed, or have they changed in relation to, whether children, young people, young adults are listened to, and are people still being told to forget about it and get on with their lives, or has that changed?
I think we can say a lot has changed on that. So when I was raped, I was 4 years and 9 months old, and I was playing on my own in the local park, which raises questions in itself. What was a little boy doing then? My mum was of a wartime generation. She was quite elderly. Well, she was 45 years old when she was pregnant with me. She'd got through the war, and her generation, I think, that's how they coped with that trauma. It was, don't talk about it. My dad was, a senior officer in wartime, and I'm pretty sure saw terrible things, but he never talked about it. So it was the sort of
stiff upper lip stereotype, kind of British stiff upper lip, was it?
Well, yeah. I mean, but not only the stiff upper lip, but also there was a sort of notion that this is the best way. That there isn't really any other way, that one just didn't. It was it wasn't just impolite, it was not doable. That was the thing. So I ran in floods of tears. My mum put me in the bath. There was it was a complicated setting. I mean, my dad was a senior officer. We had a Chinese-speaking nanny. My first language was Cantonese. And I spoke Cantonese better than I spoke English. I ran in. Ling An, the nanny, and my mum put me in the bath, and there was clear, obvious evidence of rape. So there was no way, that I was telling fibs. But my mum just said, try to forget about it. She was sympathetic. She knew it was horrible. She knew something terrible had happened. She said, try to forget about it. And in what I could tell at the time was a well-meaning way, even though I was only young. But because Ling An and I spoke Cantonese, my mum said to Ling An, don't talk about it. But we spoke Cantonese, and Ling An and I would talk about it. So I had that support, although she was sent back to...
Unusual, really. Unusual, yeah, I guess.
There's so much of my experience is unusual. And it was extra familial, which is in itself unusual. Stranger danger. It does happen. It was a complete stranger who paid me £0.50, not a lot of money, 12.5p, to go into the woods with him, and then use force. So I never had the kind of feeling that many survivors have who have been groomed, that in somehow I'd gone along with it. Yes, I took the money, but I had the clear message that it was wrong, both from my mum and from Ling An. And then when I was sent to a boarding school at the age of 8, where the head teacher started in very similar way to basically pull my head into his groin with his clothes on. I thought, this is wrong. I knew if I screamed and shouted, somebody would come. So I put up a fight. And I've been fighting pretty much ever since. Mm-hmm. I'm 62 years old now, and mm-hmm. I'm still fighting. Mm-hmm. Partly it's still my fight. But he got found out and stopped after 2 years, and a new regime put in, new head teacher, new board of governors. So, but still, the new head teacher said to me at the age of 10, did anything strange happen? I couldn't trust him enough to tell him what had happened. But we knew, there were 4 other children who were being abused and weren't putting up as much of a fight as me, who we never saw again. So they all knew it was real, but they didn't talk about it. They brushed it under the carpet. And the first the police ever knew about this was when I made my report 30 years later, subsequent to, speaking to a GP who said, again, get over it, basically. So I think all of that is now different. It's nowhere near good enough, but it's better than it was. So
what do survivors tell you now, Jon?
Well, many survivors still talk about how they did try to report 10, 15, 20 years ago and were told by the police, go away, there's nothing we can do, or not believed, or the crime is recorded but no further action. How are we ever going to prove it? Well, that's still the case. It's still very, very difficult to prove non-recent sexual violence. Even if there is, in the days of DNA evidence today, rape convictions are not really going very well. So I think people who tried to speak out in the past may have just thought, well, what's the point? Today, the police, generally speaking, will take it much more seriously. And senior police officers particularly are really proactive on this. There's excellent police teams, particularly Operation Hydrant, which deals with all of the work that comes from the inquiry, the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse. So that's institutions. And they have done very good work and secured convictions against people who committed horrific crimes many years ago in institutions. But still, we know most of what happens is within the family. And whether you're a child suffering now or whether you're somebody who suffered intrafamilial abuse years or decades ago, it's still incredibly difficult to prove that. Police will listen, but, well, for a start, the courts at the moment are a bit log-jammed due to COVID. But even then, it's hard to secure convictions. So the police are listening. The police want to get it right, but there's not a huge amount that they can do. So what we hear from survivors is, what's the point? Really? Why would I go and report to the police? The chances of ever seeing a conviction are pretty slim. I think, even if you do go through the court process and see the perpetrator convicted, that's not going to make your nightmares stop. You still need the medical support, psychiatric support, psychological support, therapeutic, whatever works for that individual. You still got to do the emotional work, the healing work for the nightmares to stop. And that's just the start of the healing process. So it's incredibly hard work. And that, I think, is what we hear from survivors more than anything else, is where is the support?
I was just going to ask whether many survivors talk about their family doctor, GP, or anyone in the community kind of health sector.
Again, it's improving. There are many, again, I think, now doctors believe it. Generally speaking, doctors are under huge amount of pressure at the best of times, and it's worse now. You've got a 10-minute slot with a GP, really, for most people. That's not a lot of time to explore complicated, non-recent abuse issues. Many survivors develop long-term health conditions, what they call comorbidities, and often they're these unexplained things that, GPs have always struggled with. Why is it that, there are so many unexplained, undiagnosable, unexplainable presentations? One of the reasons, it seems to us, is a trauma history, quite possibly. But they don't really have time to explore that, which is why so many survivors come to the third sector, and people like us and the many other charities for survivors of sexual abuse around the country, locally and nationally, because there's a bit more time to explore it there. So what could a GP offer? Well, they can offer you some antidepressants, some SSRIs perhaps, which might take the edge off it, and sometimes that's appropriate. They might be able to signpost to IAPT teams, the local improving access to psychological therapies. Again, some of those do excellent work. Some of those will only offer 6 to 12 sessions of CBT, which isn't really going to help much. And what we hear from some survivors is, it's just opening the wound and then leaving it to bleed, because it's just not enough. So the range of need is huge. The amount of need is huge. For some people, just ringing our support line and talking it through for the first time is enough. For others, they need years of support. So you can't generalize, and every case is unique. Every person's story is unique, and every person's reaction to trauma is unique. So that's what we need to create, adequate service provision around.
So I suppose what I'm hearing, Jon, from you is that obviously the 10-minute slot, is not very helpful for someone who's had a traumatic history and probably difficulty in trusting people and, telling about some very painful events in their lives. So that's one barrier. And then a second barrier I'm hearing about is they just don't have that much to offer in terms of they're offering very time limited sort of specific types of interventions like cognitive behavioral therapy. And it's just, there's not enough suitable provision out there. Those are the kind of barriers, right? Yeah. That's interesting. And I suppose one of the things that we talked about as well was how when you were a child and a young man, there was very little acknowledgement that boys could be sexually abused, partly because there's such a link with, the vast majority of abusers are males, and somewhere in the original work, about women and girls, the fact that boys were vulnerable too, and we're not just mini men was kind of overlooked, and some services would not see boys at the beginning. And I wondered, is that an area, it feels to me that there has been a lot of change there and a lot more services and recognition, but is that your feeling? And is that what survivors who get support from NAPAC feel, or?
Well, it's certainly much better than it was when I was looking for support in the early 90s. That's for sure. I think survivors, they need different things, and what's appropriate for one person isn't necessarily going to work for another. Some male survivors want their own, want to work with other men. My personal experience was I always preferred to work with female practitioners because I didn't trust men. Now, I think the other part of the problem, when I was raped in 1963, I wasn't actually legally raped. The law didn't change until the Sexual Offences Act 2003, and it was only women and girls who could be the victims of rape prior to that. What happened to me, despite the fact it was forced penetration, was legally a serious sexual assault. So, even the Sexual Offences Act 2003 was a huge improvement. It's nowhere near good enough, really. It's not, it needs another look, but it's a lot better than it was, for sure. Still under the sexual offences, so that legislation from 2003, only a man can commit the act of rape. there are people who are arguing that, forced penetration could be perpetrated by a woman. Why is that not classed as rape? Well, it's very, very rare, but it does happen. So nowhere in any of that is there any discussion of people who are, non-binary gender. That discussion is starting to come up, but for us, for NAPAC, we call ourselves, the Association for People Abused in Childhood, because we include everybody. And it's always been clear to me that people who are born into sex are more like, well, it's, and this is just from what I see, anecdotal evidence, what I see and hear, they're more likely to be abused in childhood than the general population, in the same way that children with physical or mental disabilities are more likely to be abused. They're more likely to be targeted. So where are they in all this at the moment? Nowhere that I can see. But having said all of that, the NHS has got really good policy on paper. In the NHS England Strategic Direction on Sexual Assault and Abuse Services document, talks all about all of that stuff and trauma-informed approaches and support for as long as it needs. Most of the document is about prevention, but the final section is about working with adult survivors. We've always felt that the more adults are enabled to talk about what happened, the safer the world becomes for children. And I think there's evidence to back that up, because, if our number hadn't been on the end of that documentary, things might not be as far ahead as they are now. And it has to be said that Britain is ahead of the game on this globally. There's good work in Australia, in the US, in Britain, the rest of Europe. There's nothing like this. And many other parts of the world. Children are still not believed. Adults reporting non-recent abuse are still not believed. So a lot of work to do.
On a global scale. And what do you think about Black and Asian children and children from minority backgrounds and adult survivors? Do they tend to feel comfortable using the services that are there? Are there extra barriers for them in disclosing that they have been abused or assaulted or raped?
There certainly are extra barriers, and culture and context, again, is hugely important. And there are some cultures in which abuse is normalized. So abuse in the general sense of disciplining children using physical measures, just slapping or hitting is just routine in some places, some cultures. There's also the notions of family sort of honor and shame in some cultures that make it difficult to speak out. Whether you're a male survivor and you're sort of perhaps expected to be strong, and there are all these sort of socialized notions about what it means to be a man, that's one way of closing it down. But there are other cultural ways in which the desire to reach out for support can be kind of, compromised and restricted. Just don't talk about it. So obviously people have heard about abuse within various different Christian denominations, the Catholics, various branches of Anglicanism, the Benedictines, all sorts of people in the Christian faith. But we've heard about it from every one of the major faiths, certainly, all of the Abrahamic religions, from Buddhism, Hinduism, or sort of personal charismatic sects, or even paganism, people who grew up in sort of free and supposedly loving environments in the 60s were subjected to terrible things under the heading of free love, where no boundaries were, there was no notion of boundaries or right and wrong. So it's in all
abuse
cultures.
Can happen in any setting, in any religion, in any denomination.
Absolutely.
I suppose I'm wondering about the support for people then.
Well, we always say there's no one size fits all, so it's what's appropriate for that individual, and it's about choice. And you can't make choice until you've got some information about what's available. So, that's what we try to put out there, and that's what's on our website in very plain language. These are the kinds of things that many other survivors have struggled with. We're not going to tell you how to deal with it, but here are some of the things that others have found helpful. And it's not what you're going to find in most medical practice, although there again, as I said, the NHS England strategic direction on support, sexual assault and abuse services is excellent, but there's also really good work by the British Psychological Society, the Power, Threat, Meaning Framework, written by psychiatrists. And it's all about the trauma-informed approach. And, we don't have to kind of pathologize trauma and say that somebody who's, all the time scared, angry, paranoid, whatever it may be, doesn't necessarily have a something or other disorder. It's just a trauma history. So there's lots of ways in which things are moving ahead.
When we spoke last time, you talked about this need to sort of diagnose people and sort of set them in particular clinical pathways, and how that wasn't necessarily helpful for someone who had experienced a lot of trauma and not necessarily bringing forth the best solutions for them, really. And then you did talk about that British Psychological Society paper. What kind of status would you say that paper has, Jon? How widely read is it? How much do you think it's influential in psychiatry and in the approach to people who've been abused in childhood?
Not very widely accepted, because and there's good justification for that. I mean, it is a theoretical framework. It's not backed up by scientific evidence. So there's no way that the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence can sign something off unless it's very well evidenced. They do recommend, the recommended intervention is basically CBT, maybe some trauma-focused CBT, psychotherapy can be very useful, EMDR is recommended, because you can evidence it, you can test it. CBT has been evidenced as effective intervention for depression and to an extent anxiety, but this is more complex. So how can we prove what we do works? We cannot, not to the satisfaction of rigorous clinical scientists. Randomized controlled trial, never mind double blind, it's not doable. But the whole of the charity sector, our colleagues in this area of work, we all know that supportive listening, psychoeducation, peer support, all of that kind of stuff is what survivors want and use, and then tell us, thank you very much, that was helpful. So from that perspective, it works. But mainstream psychiatry, that's not good enough, especially if you're spending public money. So I can see the sense of all of the resistance. Why, it's a tough nut to crack, but we know it works, and so that's what we do. And we're not alone in that.
The sort of biomedical approach is kind of in opposition, if you like.
I always try to present what we do as a complementary approach, because there is certainly no one-size-fits-all solution to any of this. And some people get exactly what they need from mainstream psychiatry. For some people that works, and for some people it doesn't. So, we don't hear on our support line from the people who had excellent treatment in the NHS. They're not going to come to NAPAC and say, oh, it doesn't work. We're only hearing from the ones who haven't been able to source effective support. But that's no small number. There are quite a few people who are struggling.
So, Jon, when we spoke previously, you talked about hate and power and the importance of not seeing sexual violence in a vacuum, that we have to see it in a wider context of physical force and cruelty, and of men often using their physical strength to get what they want from girls, boys and women. And I just wondered if you could talk about this a little bit more.
To get an insight into the mind of the the abuser is to venture into a very dark place. And again, just as we can't generalize about survivors, we can't generalize about perpetrators. But I suppose what I was trying to say was that hatred doesn't cover the whole issue. Now, that came to my mind, for example, recently, the death of murder Sarah Everard, everyone's invited, what's going on, people reporting abuse either by adults or peer-on-peer abuse in schools. The people who do these things, sometimes they hate, and sometimes they just don't care. So misogyny doesn't cover it. Just as I think, that thing about saying that all the hatreds live together, that's not always true, but I think there are some types of men who genuinely don't care and just enjoy hurting people for the sake of hurting people and will latch on to any type of ism, whether it's, somebody who looks different because perhaps, they're in a wheelchair or they got different skin color or whatever it may be. And for some perpetrators, sexual violence is just one terror tactic that's used to maintain power and control. For example, in circumstances of domestic abuse and domestic violence, it's just a way of terrifying the victim and keeping them controlled and locked down. So hatred in itself doesn't cover it. So when we say misogyny is a problem, of course, it's a huge problem. But it doesn't explain all of the sexual violence that goes on, particularly against women and girls, children, or adult men. And there is that group of men who will just help themselves because they don't care about the consequences. They just genuinely don't care. They want to take whatever it is that they're driven to take. But that's not the whole, that's just one type of perpetrator. There are clearly some perpetrators who do specifically hate women, or perhaps women and girls. I think we do see misogyny and hatred of sort of people of different colour or sexual orientation occupying a similar space, perhaps we could say that.
And clearly, our colleagues in the health professions have a lot to offer to people who are being abused. And I suppose, given your experience over decades of talking to survivors and supporting them, what would you want to say to health practitioners who work in the community about how to respond to children, young people or young adults who may be trying to tell them or maybe trying to show them in some way that they're in distress and are being sexually abused?
I think just listen is the short answer to that. However, we have to recognise that many practitioners in statutory agencies are compromised. So, I was a teacher for 10 years. I was told in my teacher training, if a child starts to disclose, you have to stop them. Because, they might say something that has to be disclosed and confidentiality breached. That's not how I actually operated. I heard disclosures and I passed them up the line. I think perhaps less so today, but in the past, mental health practitioners had maybe thought, I'm not sufficiently expert in this specialist area of sexual trauma. I have to pass it on to somebody who is skilled in this particular area. All it really takes is listening. And non-judgmental listening, which can be very hard to do. So that in itself needs to be supported. And people who hear disclosures on a regular basis are sooner or later almost bound to develop what in the US they call secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma. You can be overwhelmed by hearing this kind of thing again and again and again. So that needs support. And I think the police are learning that. Various mental health practitioners are learning that. But it is just open-mindedness and engagement, I think, and not being judgmental in all sorts of ways. So victim blaming is still around there in some ways. People say, women shouldn't wear short skirts, or girls shouldn't, walk home alone, or whatever it may be. That is victim blaming. It's the fault of the perpetrator. So don't make judgments about how it happened, but also don't make judgments about how the survivor has coped, which could include substance use or food issues of too much food, too little food. I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which we turn the damage against ourselves. And that can sometimes be seen as, oh, you're beyond help because you're doing this, and you can't have a clinical intervention until you stop drinking. Well, that's not very realistic. People need the support. Don't be judgmental, and be open-minded and listen, I think is what I would like to see.
So it just remains for me to thank you ever so much for the interview today. It was lovely to speak to you. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you for having me.